Hello and welcome back to another game review. My name is Syken. Today we're taking a look at Crown Wars: The Black Prince. I'm regularly reviewing games and specifically out of the tactical genre. Before we're jumping into it though, I want to give a bit of a word of advice. I am a strict reviewer. That means I am not buying into the idea that every game is a 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10. Quite the contrast, we are looking at a 6 out of 10 if a game is good, 7 out of 10 if it is very good, 8 out of 10 if it is exceptionally good, 9 out of 10 if it could be game of the year, and 10 out of 10 if it is a genre-defining game. On top of that, I am not going to do a long review, so we're really cutting to the chase and answering the question, is Crown Wars: The Black Prince worth it? And if so, what are the strengths and weaknesses? Let's jump right into the first category. Crown Wars: Black Prince is staged in the medieval times, more precisely the 100 Years' War between France and England. But instead of doing a complete historical recap, it's more reimagination with a bit of a occult / magical undertone. The overall game manages very well to portray the medieval times, with a few exceptions. Some of my viewers took offense in the idea that there are female knights, which in hand-to-hand combat indeed wouldn't make a lot of sense. Others pointed out that the game itself is not fully historically accurate. Whether or not you are taking offense in that is up to you. I would say the game does an okay job in setting the scene. My points of criticism with the game are more fundamental in nature. When I'm looking at lore and background, I'm predominantly looking at the game's ability to flesh out the world, to tell a cohesive story that is meaningful, and the game does not do that over long periods of time. There are a couple of interlude and cutscenes, so the main storyline is actually really good, and I could recommend that. However, in between that main storyline, there is a lot of slog that isn't really helping the game. Factions are introduced, but don't really have any discernible features. A couple of characters are introduced to the stories, but then disappear just as quickly as they have been originally introduced. And the NPCs that you're working with in your own fortress aren't particularly helpful either, or let's say not particularly memorable. So everything that would fill into that idea of a lively world isn't fully fleshed out. I attribute this to the quick release, but it is definitely noticeable. So overall, I give it a 5 out of 10 in the lore and background compartment, and that is the foundation that the game is building upon. All right, next category, graphic and graphical user interface. The game here is dead on average. I would say, looking at the graphic, there are a couple of things that are very nice. For instance, the models that are in place look decent and appealing to the eye. The textures that are in place are fine for what they are supposed to be doing. All of the characters do have individual headgears and individual armor, but let's say the depth of the individualization, both of your characters as well as the enemies, isn't fully on par with other games. So the graphical assets are sparse, to be precise. Some of the weapons are not very well fleshed out. And for instance, the weapons, even though they become better, never change in the texture whatsoever. Also, you cannot really individualize your characters. On top of that, some of the textures simply are broken. For instance, the bloodied weapon texture basically makes your weapon spill out blood continuously instead of slightly making it bloody. My judgment on the graphical user interface is it does get its job across. It does do so okay, but it doesn't particularly reinvent the graphical user interface. Main points of criticism for the graphical user interface would be information is either very difficult to obtain. Example for that is if enemies or your characters do have debuffs, you need to hover over with your mouse and wait for a few seconds. It doesn't even always work, and then you will see the debuffs. That makes it very, very cumbersome to actually go through the damage that enemies or your characters will be taken and accordingly react. Another example of graphical user interface not being good would be the inavailability of information. Sometimes it is unclear why an enemy can move a 5-foot step, but you cannot. Once you get more familiar with the system, there are actually rules to that, such as a vision field of the enemy, and the moment that you're leaving said vision field, an attack of opportunity is triggered. But the game never really explains that, and unless you're an absolute veteran of the genre, it will be very difficult for you to understand the fine nuances of it. And it goes on, the list goes on and on. You do have a problem of actually seeing the front and back of an enemy. Sometimes there is a mispositioning of the enemy. Sometimes animations bug out, such as the archery animation, that if you're hitting the animation too fast, it will trigger a game stall. And some animations are simply not properly playing, such as attacks of opportunities or interrupting attacks. There is a long list of things that are not fully implemented. And I just have to wonder why the game had been released in such state, because all of that could have easily been fixed with a proper game test. Anyways, moving on. Next up, we're looking at sounds and sound effects. So, the game itself features a neat little array of sounds and sound effects. I'll give it that. It is not necessarily a wasteland in terms of catchy music, but the game does have its own appeal. The weapon sounds are crisp. The interaction in medieval combat warfare is believable, and some of the orchestral soundtracks are better than kind of free-to-play synthie tracks. So all of that is good. There is parts of the game, specifically the main storyline, that is fully voiced with a narrator and individual characters. I will say that the dialogue and the dialogue, how they are portrayed, aren't particularly deep. I would rather say they are shallow. There are no dialogue options as well. So from a sound perspective, the game does offer the expected set of sounds, but nothing more than that, leaving it at a good rating. It's nothing to write home about. Let's move into the meaty part of the review, the tactical gameplay. Tactical gameplay is the section which is typically the longest. I will this time divide it and put a lot of my main criticism into replayability, because there are a couple of things that are really bad, and I want to address those. So when we talk about tactical gameplay, this really focuses on the core aspects of the game. Two things. Number one, the tactical layer, which is what you're currently seeing, so the in-fight battle, as well as the strategic layer, which is the castle design. So I was debating lengthy with myself whether or not I want to give it a 5, a 6, or a 7 out of 10. Ended up with a 7 out of 10, because the game itself has a lot of potential, and if you're willing to ignore the rough edges, then it can be indeed very good. However, that being said, there are quite a few rough edges, and this is what makes the game quite annoying and sometimes hard to like. I'm very sorry about that, because the game would have a fantastic potential if it would have been done in a better way. For starters, the game does not come with any mod support, which means a lot of the problems cannot be modded out. So you're left with your own devices if something isn't really working out well for you. Secondly, the battle, or the core fundamentals of the battles are good, very good actually, but require you to put in some effort to understand them in detail. There is some in-game tutorial that can help you, as of a description of the list of all status effects and so on, but that does not sufficiently prepare you for the actual battle and what's going to happen. So a few things to put out there. Number one, the core aspect of the game, as in the core fight, which includes 6 different character classes, different weapons, melee and range, different skills. and different skill sets is actually quite viable and palatable. I will say that part is good, and that's the main reason why I've given it a 7 out of 10. It is enjoyable, the fight itself feels challenging, and there is a bit of tactical depth to it, which is something that not every game achieves. Matter of fact, I'm playing a lot of tactical games, and many tactical games get that part wrong. So kudos for the designers for actually designing a game that has a certain appeal in the tactical fighting department. That being said, however, there are quite a few rough edges that need to be balanced out. So let's start with a few of the main concerns of this game in terms of tactical gameplay. Number one, not all of the choices that you can make have an equal impact. And yes, games don't need to be perfectly balanced, but this game in particular is a great example of not being very well thought through. An example for that would be you're having around 15 different consumable items, half of which are completely and utterly useless or inferior to other items, although you researched them either on par with the superior items or later. There are a couple of niche items that even with very, say, benevolent reading would not really make the cut. So that is one example. Another example are skills, which again don't need to be fully balanced, but the game is not taking into consideration that every utilization of the skill comes with a bit of a cost, typically an action that you require, and some of these skills are simply really bad. I'll give you a couple of examples. Some of the items that you are going to find cost you 1 action to activate them. You do have 2 actions and a movement action, so that already takes half of your potential attack actions away. If said item or said skill then gives you 1 round of increased damage, then really what you're trading is 2 attacks, 2 potential attacks with whatever damage you have, versus 1 attack with more damage. Now, unfortunately, said item doesn't triple your damage, and there is also no means of shifting actions from one character to another character, which means that the item therefore is mostly useless, and the same goes for the skills. It goes on with weapons, where some of the weapons are simply better than others, although I will say that the weapon design in this game is actually quite well done, and overall most of the weapons do have a niche that they fall in, but there are a couple of noticeable exceptions that are simply worse than other weapons. On the tactical layer, we have covered most of it. On the strategy layer, I will say that the strategy layer is a little bit too long and too repetitive. We're going to come to that in replayability. Mainly some of the design choices, such as upgrades, have really not been very well thought through, and that leaves you with a situation where you are playing the game for a very long period of time, and your choices in your capital, so kind of your base of operation, aren't that meaningful. Some of the choices are incredibly meaningful, others are minor at best, and you therefore will feel like you've wasted parts of your time. Then finally, and that is personal preference for me, I personally enjoy games that allow for different play styles. This game does potentially offer not enough enemy variety to even allow for differences in playstyles. My suggestion was maybe to open it up for modding and allow, for instance, to get other factions or just other themes and settings planted into the game. This game could be a wonderful host for, say, a high fantasy game with undeads and so on, but all of that is not available. You're basically fighting the same enemies over and over. Moving on to the last category, which is the replayability, plus a couple of other items that are not fitting into any of the other categories. All right, replayability. So there are a couple of things that are really irking me when playing the game, and it's potentially also the reason for the mixed reviews. Now, I wanted to address them here. Mainly, they all boil down to the statement that the game and the core game loop is very repetitive. So, there are a couple of things that are really just not great, and I would call them quality of life features. There is no option to skip the tutorial, which means you always have to play through the same boring combat. There is no options for many of the combat features, such as the timers, which you will see here on the top left hand side of the current gameplay. They cannot be extended or modified in any form, which makes it quite cumbersome. There is no option to speed up the actual movement and animations. You cannot move characters whilst other characters are running, which means over long periods where you just move your entire group, there is no option to move all of them together or to more quickly traverse. And that's a huge time sink. On top of that, there is no option to retrain your companion skills. So if you have chosen something, then that means you're sticking with it until the very end. That, unfortunately for me, does not fit very well, specifically if you're playing it for the first time. On top of that, keybinds do not always function, and you cannot really keybind most of the stuff, which ends up to be quite a click fest. And there's no option to abandon missions other than fleeing them once you're there. So if something happens on the strategic layer and you cannot react, then bad luck, you just have to deal with it. On top of that, there are a couple of issues with just replayability overall. So the core game mechanic boils down to, outside of the storyline missions, which, mind you, are really, really well done, the game boils down to 5 different types of missions. Type of missions that you can do are either escort a subject from A to B, free a subject and then escort it from A to B, kill a subject and run away, capture a subject and run away, or basically skirmish, so kill all enemies. And then from time to time, there's even a 6th objective, which is defend a position for 10 turns. So the challenge with that is it becomes incredibly repetitive. I'm not even going to go into the balancing of each of the missions. That's fairly okay-ish. Some are more difficult, others are easier. But it is the question of how does it feel to go through 50 to 100 missions just to upgrade your items. Which brings me to the other point, the upgrading system that I talked earlier about. You do have overall 13 different weapon categories. Each of them needs to be upgraded 4 times. You have armor, which each of the 6 armor sets needs to be upgraded 4 times. And then you do have unique weapons, 1 out of the storyline, and I think 7 out of different events, as well as random mission rewards. And you would have guessed it, all of those 7 also need to be upgraded. On top of that, you do have 4 tiers of consumables, each of the tier featuring 4 to 5 items, and all of them need to be researched before you can buy them. So overall, you're going to look at just item and weapon and armor wise to more than 120 upgrades. On top of that, each of your estate houses, 6 overall, cannot be upgraded another 3 times each, all to level 4. So we're looking at 18 basically base upgrades that you can do. And all of that is just way too much. Did I mention that in order to use weapons, you also need to upgrade the weapon skill to even unlock the additional features of a weapon? Yep, that's the thing. You can do that either the missions or your training. So there's a huge resource drag over time, which in my case, I've played over 100 missions. And if you only have 6 different missions, you do have characters from 5 different classes, mildly different skills, no discernible individuality of the factions that you're fighting. You're going to do the same type of mission over and over and over. Yes, the game loop is fun, but it stops being fun after the, say, 15th time, and then it feels more like work. And that is the main problem with the game. The repetitiveness of the loop, too little to do besides the main mission, just overall not very rewarding interaction of the upgrades that you would need, and the enemies continuously being the same old, same old. There are very few missions, the storyline missions in particular, that break that cycle. But I will tell you that they are so far and few in between that I cannot, with a good conscience, give this game anything but a 3 out of 10. I will not be playing it a second time due to what I've just mentioned. And unfortunately, a lot of these quality of life features, after you've played the game, will start to irk you quite a bit, and there is no mod support to fix it. So that is the bucket of all of the miscellaneous mixed feedback items that I needed to put in. Is the game bad? Potentially not. Is the game great? Potentially also not, which brings us to the total score. I looked at Metacritic and a couple of other forums where the game was reviewed, mainly because I was interested if it's just me or if others have similar feelings. And the game is reviewed, I think, overall as 58 out of 100%. And I think that's pretty fair. For the game, I would give it a 5, maybe with a plus, or a 6 with a minus overall. There are, and this is really unfortunate for the game, there are so many things that offer a great potential. I think the idea of a medieval XCOM, if it's done right, has a lot of potential. Wartale shows that, and if you can pull it off, even with a little bit more, say, fantasy appeal, and you're ending up with something like Divinity Original Sins. Both of these games are excellent in their own rights, but it requires you to do it right. It requires good balancing, it requires a meaningful storyline, it requires a good lore, it requires a game loop that is not repetitive, a good enemy variety. It requires really thinking through what you want to do and making sure that the average game player's experience is good. Well, although Crown Wars: The Black Prince does have some of that, the main storyline is engaging, the sound, the graphics are okay, it never really excels at any of these features, and is left in mediocrity over the course of its existence. Is it a title that you should buy if you can get it on sale? Potentially yes, if you're an enthusiast of tactical games. It's actually good and has a nice game loop if you enjoy the tactical battles for what they are worth, tactical battles. But if you find yourself easily annoyed about the many features in the game that are not fully implemented, if you want a polished experience, and if you want something on par with, say, Gears Tactics, Chaos Gate, War Tales, or Jagged Alliance, then this game will simply not pull its weight in that kind of weight class. It is good, but not more than that. Thanks a lot for watching. Do you agree with what I had to say? If you have played the game, I would like to get your criticism as well. Leave a comment down below and see you in the next game review. Bye bye.